Children's stories are essential but neglected aspects of learning to read. I'm Darlene DeMarie from the University of South Florida. My first teaching job was at Dexter City Elementary School. Dexter City is a little village in Ohio with a population of 122 people. I was born in New York and raised in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, a town of more than 30,000 people in just 3 square miles. I was in culture shock. The only materials my district gave me were a reading series, writing paper, and a math series. This was going to be an adventure. The reading book stories had absolutely no connection with my children's lives. For example, there was a story about the airport. None of my children had ever been to an airport. They barely left their farms or the little town. Nothing in that reading series connected with their lives, and I didn't think children's first reading should be about places or things they had never experienced. On top of that, only 5 of the 33 children in my first grade class knew any letters of the alphabet at the beginning of the year. How can you read words you never heard of when you're looking at symbols that have absolutely no meaning to you? I imagine myself trying to read Chinese. How would I feel if my teacher expected me to read these Chinese symbols? I got some paper that had blank space on top and lines below, and I started using children's stories to help them to learn to read. I met with each child individually. The children drew a picture on the top of the page, and then I had them dictate to me what that picture was about, and they watched as I wrote the words they said on a piece of paper. Children were excited to share their stories with one another. I invented a time at the end of the day that children could elect to read their printed stories back to others. And guess what? Reading became effortless. They loved to read their stories. But what was interesting is the children who wrote the best stories were the ones who really didn't care about reading their story. Other children would say, "Billy, why don't you read your story?" Billy would bow his head. So I made another rule. If a child approves, anyone can read the child's story for him. That was an interesting thing to do. Penmanship got better because the kids were embarrassed if someone couldn't read their writing. Children would light up when another child read their story, and others would say, "That's a great story." And sometimes I would lead a discussion about what was it that made that story so interesting. I took all of this learning with me when I was a Fulbright scholar in South Africa. From 2007 to 2009, I co-created the University of Limpopo's Child Development Center. I invented biographies. The teachers and I would meet with a child, each child individually, and we used a predictable pattern. My name is I like. I took a picture of the child, and the child's picture and their words were on the page. These biographies hung on the wall, and children loved to read them. In fact, they played with them. You could see they stopped play, and they're going to read. There was no separation between play and reading. That little boy you see behind, he was really bashful because he was nervous about reading. But when everyone disappeared, he went up to read his own story. These biographies brought children together, and it created a sense of community. What was interesting to me was 80% of what the South African children said was important to them that they liked was food related. I like chicken. I like rice. Then in 2017, I took that learning and I extended it even further. So first we did biographies at the beginning of the year, and then we started doing storybooks. Let me explain. The biographies were just like the South African children's biographies, with the predictable pattern, and every child told 3 things they liked that were important to them. What was fascinating was 60% of what these American children from families with no privilege, what they liked was food related as well. It wasn't that different than South Africa. The food was, I like hamburgers, I like pizza, but the food was the same. Let me take you through one child's books over time. I started creating books with children by allowing them to take 5 pictures with my phone, and then we would sit down and they would explain to me the story about each of the pictures. I asked them to show others what their school was like and what was important to them. You're going to see how this child progresses from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year. Here's the first book. Now, each of these pictures represents 1 page. So this is 1 sentence per page. And you're going to notice all the pictures were taken outdoors on the playground. The child said, "These are cones to play with. I play on the stage with the cones. I play on the stage with the cones. I ride bikes at school. I ride bikes to school. I stand on the table. I stand on the table." That's the end of the first book. I made 2 copies of each book. 1 stayed at the school and 1 went home with the child. What was interesting to me is that children loved to read each other's books, and they constantly were getting reading practice. I learned about their perspective about school and learning and how their perspectives changed over time. This boy's second book, or it was a different book in the middle of the school year, all of a sudden this book was focused on friends. Here's a sample of 1 page. I love all my friends. Notice the children's biographies are now becoming a symbol of their friends. It was very interesting to see how friendship emerged as an important part of school. Now let's go to the same child's book at the end of the school year. This was a field trip to the History Museum, and back then we had money for field trips, which of course we no longer have now. It's unfortunate. But here's the boy's books about school. The title of the book, which he titled himself, was his name, Goes to the History Museum. The first page had 3 full sentences on a theme. We went on the interstate. I was sitting in the front seat with another child. We rode the school bus. Think of the complexity of that language compared to the first book he wrote. We were in the museum. The class played with blocks. We were watching a movie. The teacher was clapping her hands. I saw Kay and his baby sister. Now this child loved the perspective taking. He would go up on the stairs, look down, see what all the children were doing. Then he'd go down to that place and play with that. So that was part of the learning, was the perspective taking. I was going to wait over there. I will play with the toy sharks. I will play with my spinner. I will play with the lighthouse. I don't see people in there. I was playing with the bolt game. The end. How much richer. Again, these books, we had copies of every child's book in the classroom, and children loved to read each other's book. Parents reported that the book that I sent home, the child wanted to read to anybody who would listen. Grandma and Grandpa could learn about school, aunts, uncles, the whole family learned about the child's experiences at schools. Reading their own and other stories gave children practice reading. No one had to force them to read. No one had to bribe them with candy rewards. Printed text made sense when it was the child's own story. It wasn't a stupid workbook page about a story with no meaning to the child. I saw how children's stories connected them with printed symbols on pages. I learned far more about children's reading than any multiple choice test could have ever told me about their reading proficiency. I hope to help to change early childhood reading teaching practices. I think children's stories are the key to future success. And I hope as you hear this talk and see the evidence, I hope I've convinced you as well. Thank you.